we're going to talk about the Progressive Era. The Progressive Era, simply put, is this time from about 1900 to about 1920 where different Americans began to try to address the problems of the Gilded Age. Now, if you remember from last time when we were talking about the Gilded Age, there were a number of problems that became very apparent in American society. A lot of these revolved around the rise of cities, urbanization, industrialization, this rapid growth of technological advancement offered many really cool benefits, but also came at a price, especially as people began to be pulled into factories, worked very hard for long hours. We also have this issue of immigration, where we have this influx of people from places that were previously not so represented, specifically places like Russia, Poland, Italy. And a lot of times many Americans would think that this new wave of immigration were bringing in ideas that were contrary or in conflict with more accepted mainstream American values. We saw that there was a nativist backlash. Remember, nativism is a form of ethnic discrimination in which Americans tended to other people who were coming from these diverse backgrounds and held ideals that might be seen as in conflict with their own. So if we give a really distinct definition of what the Progressive Era is, it is a period of time from 1900, sometimes you'll see 1890, but the turn of the century until about 1920, where a number of diverse Americans began to emerge and to say that we needed to rethink issues revolving around urbanization, industrialization, and immigration in particular. Historians often point to a couple of very specific examples in the Progressive Era to really showcase what progressives were up to. You'll often see in textbooks the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is one of these like main events that historians point to that really show the problems of the Gilded Age emerging in the Progressive Era and how there is this push to redress these issues. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened in Greenwich Village in New York. In 1911, one of the large buildings in which the Triangle Shirtwaist Company manufactured its clothing caught fire. What this essentially was a sweatshop. This was a large building in downtown New York where many young immigrant women were employed for long hours with poor working conditions. One day in the middle of the working day, the factory caught fire. The issue here is that there were no preventative measures. These young immigrant women were locked in for long periods of time. They worked under harsh conditions. There were no fire exits. There was no way out. When the fire started, 145 mostly young immigrant women ended up burning to death, many of which jumped out the windows trying to get away from the fire. Obviously, we can see that this is, all of the problems of the Gilded Age kind of boiled into one specific example. Industrialization, immigration, urbanization, all of these things are really coming to a boiling point. And many of the community began to push back against and say, who is going to be held accountable for this? Political cartoons are being pushed out into media saying, these young immigrant women were essentially murdered because there was no accountability, no oversight. New Yorkers began to push for government oversight. There has to be some kind of responsibility for when something like this happens. We have to have working conditions, fire escapes, safety protections and precautions that are mandated. Otherwise, this will continue to happen again. This begins to reframe the narrative, and those Gilded Age captains of industry, think the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, right, the J.P. Morgans. There's a new narrative that begins to emerge and say these are not captains of industry, but these are robber barons. These are people who are suppressing the everyday individual, the people that are coming here for opportunity, the common American, in order to make untold riches on top of their oppression and their labor. Let's think about who are the progressives. We use this term in a very specific way. Progressivism is typically associated with things like socialism, identity politics, gay rights, racial issues, right? But if we think about progressivism in the early 20th century, there are some parallels there, but often we might see that there are some differences as well. Think about who are the progressives of the early 20th century. The answer is not entirely clear. It's a group of very diverse individuals who came together, sometimes in concert and sometimes in tension, in order to effect positive social change. There were members of the press, religious figures, there were political activists, many of them were politicians, journalists. We can see that progressivism or the progressive ethos actually encompassed a lot of diverse individuals and a lot of diverse causes or social issues. Progressives are diverse and kind of this patchwork of people that are coming together in the 20th century to fix social problems. I think there are some things that we can say, this is kind of a hallmark of the progressive perspective. And a couple of these things are, an optimism about the future, a trust that the government can help institute regulation restrictions in order to make life for the common man better. A very high view of education. They had a faith in science. They believed that science could be harnessed and education was a positive tool that should be implemented to change social good. They were promoters of efficiency. They thought that systems should be harnessed and maximized in order to produce the best thing. Sometimes this meant refining things in order to create better systems that created more social goods. Sometimes this kind of had a backlash. A really good example of progressivism perhaps gone off the rails is Taylorism, or the idea that the assembly line could be harnessed to every second in a mechanistic factory could be harnessed to produce something the cheapest and most effective. So we can see that the progressive tendency can have social benefits or try to move towards social justice, but sometimes its focus on efficiency can have a backlash and actually make things more oppressive in certain environments. Lastly, progressives tend to be pragmatists. This means that they're less ideologically driven, less given to tradition. They tend to believe that systems and rules could be changed or can evolve over time in order to create a better and new future. This means that if something works, good. If it doesn't, then throw it out and try something different. This pragmatic approach means that progressivism is sometimes hard to pin down, and it can evolve and it can change over time. Let's look at a couple examples of progressives. I remember the word muckraker. This was actually a pejorative title that Teddy Roosevelt gave to journalists in the progressive era because he was saying that these journalists were pulling the muck, they're pulling the dirt out into the light. We might think of this as like investigative journalism. One of the clearest examples of this is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. You might have read this in high school or be familiar with it prior to this. So Upton Sinclair was a socialist reformer. He was a politician, a journalist. He had originally set out to make the American public sympathetic to the plight of the worker. You know, these people who are working untold hours in terrible working conditions in meatpacking plants. There was no OSHA or health protections. He went in and he began describing what life was like in these meatpacking plants. What he produced was an indictment on the meatpacking industry, and the depiction that he put forward was that, you know, these workers were working these long hours, that there was no safety oversight. Sometimes they might lose thumbs that would fall into the sausages, and despite the fact that he was trying to make people sympathetic to the plight that they were in, he actually grossed people out. You know, this quote is he said later that he aimed at the public's heart, but he hit them in their stomach. Either way, it was effective, right? So Upton Sinclair's The Jungle came out, and people didn't want, say, pieces of workers' parts in their sausages. So there begins to be this push for federal regulation. This led to actual policy, Food and Drug Acts. We have the Meat Inspection Policy of 1906. Ida Tarbell was another muckraker. She wasn't so much focused on meatpacking industry as she was the large monopoly that Rockefeller had started. So she ends up producing this history of Standard Oil that went after John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, and she essentially did this investigative journalism project where she would go in and show how Standard Oil Company had ties up to Washington, had choked out businesses and small companies, had suppressed organized labor, had pushed out any kind of push for protections in the work environment, essentially demonizing Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company as an insidious large monopoly that made fortunes off the backs of its workers. The success of her history of Standard Oil Company pioneered investigative journalism, and many people copycatted that after, laying the groundwork for a whole genre of literature. Other examples of progressives are settlement houses. The most famous of this is Jan Adams' Hull House in Chicago. If you think about what settlement houses are, they are essentially a rejection of social Darwinism. They're almost a sort of a charity or a benevolent organization where there can be this place of refuge where immigrants who are coming in Chicago can get childcare, take a shower, have somewhere to stay, learn job skills, learn English. It's rejecting the idea of social Darwinism or the idea that only the strongest survive. And it's actually reinterpreting the Darwinian landscape in a more positive perspective. It's saying, look, help people adapt to the environment that they are living in. If you pull in and give people the right resources, then they will be able to thrive, succeed, and have good lives. The idea here is that you can bring the urban poor into American society. They can be acclimated or acculturated. You can see that perhaps there's a little bit of a paternalistic tinge to this. But you can see also how the outlook is to create positive social change. Jane Addams and the Hull House became a model for hundreds of other settlement houses across the nation. Next, let's look at changes in religion. We've seen many religious advocates here throughout this class. We've seen John Withrop, we've seen Jonathan Edwards, we've seen Finney, George Whitefield, right? We see all of these great awakenings that happen, these kind of conservative emergence of revivals that had kind of overtaken American society. In the progressive era, we really begin to see what is considered a liberal shift in American Christianity that happens. A really good example of this is the social gospel, where Americans who are trying to address some of these social issues merge it with the common cause of Christianity. The best examples of this is Walter Rauschenbusch in Hell's Kitchen in New York. Here we have a Baptist pastor ministering to German immigrants in one of the harshest places to live in New York City. Rauschenbusch believed that the older versions of Christianity that focused on salvation, or if someone was going to heaven or hell, didn't really address the problems of the here and now. Rauschenbusch began to push for social things like feeding the poor, housing the homeless, helping the old or infirmed, right? Things that we think of as social issues. He says that the purpose of Christianity was to address social issues in the here and now, rather than focusing on abstract things like heaven or hell or the afterlife. He would frame things like sin not as a personal thing that people would do, but as social evils. Washington Gladden is another example. This is another minister who really focused on the social aspects of Christianity. He's often referred to as one of the first clergymen to support unionization or the plight of the worker against big business. He would write books like Applied Christianity or Social Salvation. You can see that this is a really big shift. It's a shift in focus away from things like, sinners in the hands of an angry God, for instance. Very famously, he would reject a $100,000 donation from John D. Rockefeller, basically saying that his congregation didn't need money that was built on the oppression of Americans. Next, the push for women's suffrage is definitely going to culminate in the Progressive Era. One of the easiest amendments to remember, the 19th Amendment, was passed in 1920. We remember that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they had begun that women's movement all the way back in the middle of the 1800s. As the 15th Amendment was passed, this began to split the women's movement. Some began to continue to support a universal push towards access to voting. Others began to double down and focus specifically on the women's aspect of it. Eventually, these two factions came back together and began to unite in the 1890s. We began to see the suffrage movement really begin to flower in the early 1900s and culminate with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Progressivism wasn't just relegated to journalists and clergymen and social reformers. There were also politicians that were really steeped in the progressive ethos as well. President Theodore Roosevelt's probably one of the best examples. President Roosevelt, who is known for his energetic masculinity, he's the police commissioner of New York, becomes a colonel in the Spanish-American War. He's this big game hunter, very aggressively masculine person, but he also becomes the face of a turning point in American politicians that moves away from that laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century. He begins to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act, or anti-monopoly legislation that begins to get passed at the end of the Gilded Age, and he begins to be known as a trust buster. He comes in and he's wanting to break up these huge monopolies. He really begins to focus on the dissolution of these big monopolies. He eventually goes after J.P. Morgan, even Rockefeller going after Standard Oil as well. 1902, in a very big break from that Gilded Age perspective, where the federal government would come in on the side of big business whenever there was an altercation between organized labor or big business. He sits down with the coal owners and the union laborers, and he essentially says there has to be a square deal. You have to come to an agreement and a position, and he barters this, even going to the point of threatening nationalization of the mines, which might not have happened, but didn't come to that. Eventually there's this broker, this agreement that they come to. A huge break from that tradition of always suppressing labor and supporting business associated with the Gilded Age. Roosevelt was also a naturalist. Here you begin to see, a president begin to step in and say, we're going to fight large lumber businesses and cattle business, and we're going to begin to secure, over 150 million acres of public land in order to secure large national parks and to make sure that there is a long-lasting physical face of the country that's not overtaken by business interests or profit. Woodrow Wilson, who was in office from 1913 to 1921, was also seen as a progressive president. The first Southern president since the Civil War. He was the president of Princeton University and ended up presiding over the high tide of American progressivism. During that time, we see the institution of the Federal Reserve in 1913. We see the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, established in 1913 as well. It could prosecute corporations for unfair practices. Wilson's example also shows the shortcomings of progressivism. Historians often talk about how there is this high tide of progressive reform where we begin to have this oversight and legislation with the intention of securing the rights of the common man and making competition possible in the face of monopolies. But historians also talk about the Progressive Era as the nadir, the lowest point of race relations in America. And this is specifically because of the institution of Jim Crow in the South. You also have the rampant explosion of lynching as well, not just in the South, but also in the North. Woodrow Wilson himself would be a supporter of segregation, as we can see, and would often shy away from implementing things that would alienate his conservative Southern base. He would refer to segregation not as humiliation, but as a benefit. Lynching wasn't the only thing that showed the failures of the Progressive Era. The Supreme Court, much in the way it did in the 1850s, began to continue to pass legislation that suppressed Black Americans' rights. Clearest example of this is the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. Here we have Homer Plessy, who is a person of mixed heritage, both mixed, black and white, who was intentionally chosen to violate Louisiana's Separated Car Act. He goes in and is arrested for going into the wrong car, black person going into the white car. This goes up to the Supreme Court. In a 7-1 decision, the Supreme Court says that these Louisiana laws of segregation in the South did not violate the 14th Amendment. As long as accommodations are equal, they may be separate without violating the 14th Amendment. This legitimized Southern segregation laws, and it laid the groundwork for Jim Crow for another 50, 60 years. Progressivism made its inroads into black communities as well. If we think about really pivotal black thinkers at the turn of the century, it's probably right to think about people like Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois as progressive thinkers themselves. Historians often talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois as having conflicting views about how to address the social evils leveled against black Americans during the Progressive Era. Washington is often portrayed as focusing on shying away from political engagement, not trying to immediately overdo Jim Crow laws in the South, but instead arguing that black Americans in the South should not run to the North, but should, put their pail down there, and they should learn some sort of technical skill, something that would make money, and that eventually that stability and self-sufficiency would earn the respect of white Americans on the long run. We can see how this is progressive in itself. It is this belief in technical ability and efficiency and scientific training that makes Booker T. Washington's philosophy very progressive, even if it differs in W.E.B. Du Bois's approach. Famously, Du Bois would critique Booker T. Washington's approach as accommodationists. Instead, W.E.B. Du Bois would say that black Americans should embrace things like the humanities, higher education. Du Bois is the first black man to graduate from Harvard. He would go on to talk about how there should be this talented 10th that could help secure economic and political rights for black Americans. Both men's efforts will be radically transformational, as Washington would help form the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and then W.E.B. Du Bois would go on to help co-found the NAACP, the National Advancements of Colored Peoples, in 1909. Last but definitely not least, I think that we should think about the contributions of Ida Wells in the progressive vein. Wells, an investigative journalist and educator that was there for the founding of the NAACP, was integral in beginning to upend or expose the lies of the South during the Jim Crow era. She very famously would write the Southern Horrors, Lynch Laws in All Its Faces, and essentially what she would do is turn the fictitious narrative of the South on its head. The myth that the South would tell itself was often revolved around how lynching was a vigilante effort to push back the aggressive advances of black men towards white women, and she would go on to overturn such a myth, and she would recount how lynching throughout all of its phases was an intentional ploy of Southern racists to subjugate black people throughout the South during the Progressive and Jim Crow eras.